Hi everyone, and welcome to today's GG&A webinar on Alumni Relations and Development, to integrate or not to integrate. Some say yes, some say not yet. I'm Lana Buseman from the marketing team here at GG&A, and we're very excited for you to join us. Before we begin today, I want to go over some technical details. We ask that if you can, please log into WebEx before dialing in. Once you launch the webinar, a window will appear on your screen similar to what you see on slide 1. If you've already called in, please hang up and follow the instructions in the window to dial in. Then we will be able to associate your phone with your name. Next, we may ask some yes or no questions during the session. Please look at the slide on the screen to see where you can answer yes or no. Also notice the raise your hand feature. During the session, your phone will be muted. If you want to ask Chris and Shane a question directly, please raise your hand, and that will signal to me that you want to ask them a question, and I will unmute your line so you can speak with them. We also encourage you to use the chat panel shown on slide 3 in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen for any questions or comments during the session. Please notice that we ask you to direct your question to all panelists so that the presenters and I can see it and field the question. At the end of today's session, we're going to ask everyone to take a 1-minute survey to let us know what you thought of the webinar. So please stick around for that. If at any point during the webinar you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send me an email at lbuseman@grensclear.com or call our meeting provider WebEx directly at 866-229-3239. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Hello. We're excited to have everyone here today. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And we have folks from all over the United States and a couple in the UK logging in to join us. So thank you for spending some time. We're expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 people. I'm showing a little over 40 right now, but you never know how these go. So for those that have joined in so far, great. Welcome, thank you. We may have some others joining as we get rolling here. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Hopefully we can have a good, lively discussion today. I did indicate I sent out a all attendee chat in the lower right-hand corner. If you look down there, you'll see it says, please use the chat. We absolutely encourage you to do so. As we go along, if you have a question, please throw it out there. If I'm speaking, Shane might be able to answer it and vice versa. I think it's helpful that we get a dialogue going in that. And if you are interested in raising your hand and asking an audio question, happy to do that as well as we go along. So today we're going to dive into this topic that I put into the category of hot topics within alumni relations and development in the world of advancement. We've given this talk, Shane and I actually paired up to do this talk at the Case District 1 and District 2 conferences, and I think a couple of the attendees on the call actually on the webinar today may have even been in attendance. So this is a bit of a reprisal. There's some similar information, but some new information as well. So if you've seen the one live, you're going to get a little bit of that and a little bit of some other news material that we developed just for the webinar. And I'll end this introductory point by saying this is something we hear about all the time in our business. I am an alumni relations professional. I work in the advancement field, and I hear about this issue all the time. And I think it's a timely one. I think it's an important one. I think it's something we should all talk about, get out there. But there really is no definitive or clear, one answer to this. This is an ongoing discussion that we've had in our industry, and I think it's just important we put it out there and keep it going. So the point of the webinar today is to present as fairly and openly and evenly as we can both sides of this integration issue, and hopefully you'll have your chance to weigh in with your opinion and share your thoughts if you're so willing to do so. So let's dive in here. I can work the webinar material. I got it. Introduction. So you saw our backgrounds in the invite for this webinar. I won't read. I am not a big fan of death by PowerPoint in person or by webinar, so we're not going to read every single word on every single slide. Hopefully that's okay with all of the attendees. I'll share with you my background very quickly in that I am a Lehigh University graduate, class of '88. I still live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I moved back here recently, actually, right near Lehigh. I spent 12 years of my first part of my career. I was the head men's and women's swimming coach at my alma mater. So I have an interesting sort of career path. I call it my crooked mile. I moved into alumni relations in 2001 to run Lehigh's Alumni Association as the executive director for 7 years, and I left to go to Cornell University for about 5 years and run as the Associate Vice President, run their Alumni Affairs program. And I do understand that we have some Cornell staff on the call. Shout out to my former colleagues. Hope you're doing well. And in December of 2012, I left Cornell to join GG&A, Prince Buckler & Associates, a firm that's been around for about 50 years, doing consulting in all walks of nonprofit life. And a big part of our business is higher ed, and we've never had a dedicated alumni relations person in the firm until I joined in December of 12, and I've been spending the last year plus building the alumni relations practice. You'll see the clients I've worked with on the bottom of this slide here, expanding the reach of our services to include engagement, and I think it's important that we think of it that way as we move forward as a firm. So I'm going to flip it over to my partner in crime here. Shane, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, morning, evening to everyone. It's great to be with you all. As Chris mentioned, my name is Shane Dunn, and I currently oversee all external relations, development, marketing, public relations for a network of public charter schools in Boston, Massachusetts. But prior to coming over here in October of 2013, I worked for 6+ years in higher education advancement in the Boston area, specifically at Harvard University at a school there. Then I moved on to Tufts University. And my most recent work in higher education was at the MIT Sloan School of Management. So I do have, a fair amount of higher education experience working in a few different models that we will talk about today. Most recently at MIT Sloan, which was a hybrid model, which we'll speak more to. I'm also a proud alumnus of Cornell University, which is one of the ways I was fortunate to meet Chris and then other colleagues who I also want to give a shout out to on the line. And I have a master's degree in higher education, so even though I am not currently working in higher education, I am staying connected to the field that expand across higher education, but advancement is still kind of where I grew up professionally. So I definitely, I'm proud to be with you all today, and looking forward to a great dialogue.
Thanks, Shane. So here are the goals for our session today, what we want to cover. We have, I want to say 30 some odd slides. Again, there's room for discussion and answering questions as we go here, so feel free to jump in at any point. Shane, yeah, I can hear you fine, Shane. I'm with the other panelists, but I just saw your chat bump in, so I'm going to try to multitask here. So our goals today, we're going to do a little quick background on history of alumni relations, talk about industry trends, what we're seeing emerging as we get into the current day and age, if you will, and certainly what's been happening over the last year since I've had a little bit of broader view of the industry. We're going to talk about different levels of advancement integration and how closely aligned or not an alumni relations and a development program may be. Shane is going to walk us through some examples of various models that we have found out there that I think are worth taking a look at. And then I'm going to spend the last part of it looking at Cornell, my most recent direct experience, and a model that that was evolving while I was there as a case study. So we'll look at all those. I think it will be an interesting discussion, and that's the plan. So there's some ground rules for today. Shane, you want to hit these?
Sure. So I actively, in presentations, believe in ground rules when at all possible. So Chris and I want to make this an open dialogue, as he mentioned. There is no right or wrong. There's no black or white. There's no cookie cutter to any model when it comes to organizations, but especially when you try to extrapolate that to higher education. We all know we have different situations, but there are different models out there. So let's be open to that. That's kind of an expectation that we have, and I hope you all do. We're happy to take questions throughout. We'll multitask to the best of our abilities, as Chris mentioned in the chat in the bottom right. I did mention that there are no right answers. Every institution has its own culture, background, history, and circumstances, et cetera. And then finally, Chris and I are pretty active on Twitter, and so we're happy to take messages during and after via Twitter. You can see our Twitter handles down there, and we're going to kind of kickstart a new hashtag called GGA Alumni moving forward. So please feel free to use that hashtag now, and then we'll see if we can pick anything up there moving forward. So those are our general ground rules, and Chris and I are very open to continuing the dialogue after. So please keep that in mind.
Thanks, Shane. So it helps us, we've done this live and we've done this via show of hands, it helps us to know who's there. We know your names, we've seen kind of where you're from, but I want to turn it over to Anthony for a second, do a couple quick polls. We'll explain how this works. Go ahead, Anthony.
Okay, so we just opened up the poll on the bottom right. If you could let us know in what industry you work for, and within that industry, what is your specific role in development? That'll help us get some context for the webinar.
If you look at the bottom right-hand side, there's a polling option that has popped up. We'll let it go for another minute here. Who's on the webinar? Are you in development? Are you in alumni? Are you both? Are you in communications, advancement services? Is there an other? And then in what part of it do you work? Are you in a public college, university, private, liberal arts, independent, professional, community, other? When we looked at the registrations in advance, we saw kind of a good mix of this, and perhaps even a few others. So we were trying to get a sense of the population that helps us figure out the tenor of what we want to do on the phone call. Anthony, will these results pop up to everyone or just to us? How does that work?
Just give us 1 second and the poll will close out. But right now, it'll just go to the panelists.
All right, great. That's what I thought. Give it another like 10 seconds, Anthony. Let's get moving on it. Shouldn't take that long here.
All right, Chris, it's closed.
All right. Great. Should we continue on then, Anthony, or?
Yeah, you've got the privileges now, presenter privileges now.
Great. All right, thank you. So again, we have a good mix. That's what we expected. We're seeing people sort of from all over different areas here. So thank you all for letting us know. Also note that we're up to 50 attendees. Welcome anybody who joined us late. We're diving in early in the presentation here, so welcome if you just joined us. So this is the spectrum that we're talking about. This is how I look at the world of alumni relations within an advancement structure, or how it relates to development. If you looked at this from left to right, you'll see on the far left that the example I use here is that you have an alumni relations and a development operations who don't even talk to each other. This is the staunchly separate on the far left-hand side. All of you may have heard or seen or know of shops that operate in this way. Fortunately, there's not that many anymore. This is one of the trends that's dissolving, I would say, or going away, which is good. It is something, though, that exists, and it's something that has existed in the past as well. I think it's important just to note on that extreme. On the far right, you have the term we use here is can't tell them apart, where you have alumni relations and development roles are embedded in the job descriptions of every single staff member within the advancement ranks. And you'll see some of those out there. There are examples that are fully integrated where every single staff member does both. And then, of course, in between here, the gray area, and as Shane mentioned, there really is no clear cookie cutter or easy place to pigeonhole or put people in these. We use these terminologies to sort of begin to have gradations between these two. You might have a separate shop that legally structured separately, but they are collaborative with their colleagues. You have those that on the other side in the lighter blue integrated, where an alumni relations director might also oversee the annual fund, for example, but a lot of his or her staff is very much in the pure alumni relations mindset, but they do have a portion of their team that thinks about on the development, at least the annual giving side. So this is the spectrum that we're going to be talking about. Looking at it from left to right, you have very separate and very much integrated, and we'll talk about this sort of left to right notion as we go through the course of the webinar. And then in the in-between here, Shane later on is going to actually talk about some examples that will help you sort of categorize some of these and think about maybe perhaps where you fall in this as well. So some trends that I'm seeing. This is really perspective of a guy that's been in the business for 13 years, who for the first 12 years had lots of exposure to many of the universities, worked at 2 directly, but was pretty familiar with 40 or 50 other schools out there around the country, and has spent the last year plus working with a couple dozen schools basically at the way they operate and the way they function. And I would say, if I had to put just one sentence on this, we're moving left to right on this trend line here. That we go back to this slide, what I'm seeing in more recent years, and especially over this past year, a lot of conversation of this moving from left to right. And here's some examples I'll give you. So PQUAD, as many of you are familiar with this group, is the Private College University Alumni Directors. These are 40 private schools in the United States that share data and meet regularly and have a listserv, et cetera. I was part of that group for those years that are listed here. And in 2001, if you were to ask the room, the 40 people, it wasn't that big then, but whatever the number was back in 2001, how many of you oversee both alumni relations and annual giving, as an example? Very few hands, if anyone, have gone up. There was most of us were pure alumni relations engagement professionals, if you will. And as when I left in 2012, it's not like it was 40, but it certainly was a lot more. I would say somewhere between 15 to 18 of the 40 people in that group would have said they have some responsibility aligning with not only alumni relations, but annual giving programming. Not all of annual giving in some cases, some of the broad-based work they were doing. But the point is that within that particular cohort, that group was changing within a 10-year period of time. Over the past year, so in 2013, I had 22 clients. I've had several more in the beginning of this year. There's a couple examples. So generally, again, the trend moving from left to right, but here's 2 examples I'll give you. One I could name, a large public university, University of Wisconsin, that had a 150-year-old alumni association that was a separate 501c3 from the institution, and there was a separate foundation from the institution and from the Alumni Association. And for a long time, the Alumni Association Foundation had very little of any interaction with each other. And I would even argue that there might have been a little animosity between the two. And over the course of the last several years, and really this past year, the leaders of both the foundation and the Alumni Association have seen their way to getting along better, playing nice in the sandbox, as they say, but to the point where they have legally merged the 2 organizations. So a 150-year history of being very separate have moved very quickly to a legally combined organization that is both engagement and fundraising. You have the Alumni Association and now the foundation merged together. This was announced just in the last month. There's a big article about it. There's a case study done on it. When we send out the wrap-up from this webinar, we will include a link to the story on this, and anybody that has any specific questions on it, I'm happy to discuss it with you further. You'll get our email and phone numbers after this, but there's a great example of a left-to-right move that accelerated very quickly after a long history of being very separate. And then on the elite private example here, this is a case where a new vice president comes in and sees an opportunity where there has been this separation, in some cases staunchly separate, operation, where they are seeing an opportunity for them to leverage the resource that is their engagement program, Alumni Association or Alumni Relations, and move them closer to the development side. And in a couple of cases, there's cases where we as a firm find out about these new vice presidents coming in, their intentions to make this kind of move, and the Alumni Relations person is not aware that it is happening. So these things happen. If you're an AR professional sitting on this webinar and you have a new VP or a new strategic planning process underway, or you're going to take another job somewhere else, you never know when the person above you that you report to is going to have a shift in their thinking and want to move. And we see this happen in our industry. I've been seeing it in a couple of very clear examples where the AR leader didn't know what was happening to them. And the final story I'll share with you is just sort of an anecdote. If any of you know Howard Wolf at Stanford University, he's a very close friend of mine. And when the announcement went out for this webinar, which is titled Alumni Relations and Development to Integrate or Not, some say yes, some say not yet, he got the announcement of the webinar and responded in an email to me by saying, and some say never, in his kidding around way. It's Howard's way of sort of putting his foot in the ground, or his stake in the ground, and saying, we're going to stay separate, and it's important to us. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but there's an example of an institution, one of the best alumni programs out there and best fundraising programs out there, who have a very separate model and approach. I think it's just important to note at the highest level that there's that kind of thinking out there. So there's both sides that we're going to try to present. So one more quick poll. Anthony, I'll turn it back to you. Given the spectrum I just talked about and a couple of examples I just used, would you say that you are separate or integrated, or you're separating or integrating? There's obviously some other places you could be on this, but answer this question if you could. There's 4 options, and let us know where you stand. It'd be interesting to see how the audience responds to this. We'll give it just about 30 seconds here, and then we're going to keep going on the webinar because we have lots more to cover.
So, Chris, it looks like 15% are separate, 22% are integrated, no one is separating, and then it looks like 30% of the attendees are in the process of integrating.
Right. That's pretty consistent. So I'm sorry, Anthony, what was the last thing?
Nothing.
Okay. So let's move on, and it's pretty consistent with the live audiences we polled. Most of the folks in the room were moving from that left to right or already on the right. And there were a couple that were separate, and there was one, I think, along the way that was in the process of untangling this and separating, which I found interesting. So quick history lesson now. Let's move on to this portion. To give you a little bit of background of the field of alumni relations, in the 19th century, really 1850s, you start to see examples of records of alumni relations kind of activity. And then I have a couple of examples of my past institutions, and I'm sure there's some older ones here, but in the 1870s, you'll see examples of classes organizing themselves to have reunions. A lot of these schools were formed in the early to mid-1800s, some even earlier, obviously, but you'll start to see records of what would be defined as a class reunion in the 1870s. And not long after that, as you get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, you start to see these alumni associations being formed, chartered officially with bylaws, etc. And what you'll find in a lot of these documents were language that said that we're going to support the university, including fundraising. I mean, some of the documentation I've seen from early charters and bylaws, etc., included terminology around raising money for the university to support. And really what that represented at that stage of our evolution was the beginning of what is now called annual giving programs. So schools and alumni, to support their schools, had these structures organically being put in place before any of us obviously were around and thought about this as a profession, if you will. In 1913, the Association of Alumni Secretaries, these are the predecessor, if you're an alumni director or a vice president or an associate vice president or executive director of alumni relations, the early predecessors to that position were called alumni secretaries. And in 1913, they gathered for a conference with 30 or 40 some odd people and formed this association that has over the years merged into what we now call CASE. And as you all know, over the course of last year, 2013, we celebrated the 100th year anniversary of alumni relations. This was the beginning of that, of our industry really being formally recognized. And then as you get into the early 1900s and as populations expand and transportation growth begins to happen, you start to see these regional groups evolving, the chapter of, the club of, the network of. These are all things that happened very logically and naturally early on in our history. Somewhere in the mid-20th century, you start to see this distinction between the fundraisers and the fundraisers and these, if you will, going from right to left on our scale. It wasn't a scale then, but we had to go back and sort of track it. You start to see people more separating themselves, where there's clearly a function that did what is called fundraising, a term I don't like, but that's what it was used, it's been used and still used today. I still hear it. And then the fundraising group on the other side. The public model that existed for decades here really, but 150 years in one example I'm aware of, where they formed a separate 501c3 alumni association, and in many cases there's also a separate foundation, and those two entities are legally separate, usually and certainly historically have functioned separately, and over the course of many, many years, there's different versions of how integrated or not they are, and the Wisconsin example is the one that just happened over the last year. On the private school side, you'll see more of an advancement structure where you have a vice president who oversees functions like development or alumni relations or sometimes communications or advancement services all included in it, and that tends to be the private model. But even within those, especially earlier on in the early 1900s, many of those private schools had independent alumni associations. So Cornell University, Lehigh, my two direct examples that I have, but many others that I'm aware of, have separate 501c3 charters of an alumni association that now report up into an advancement structure. And this is that last bullet on this page here where you get into this independent to interdependent to dependent. And as you moved into the later part of the 20th century and where we are today, we've moved again left to right here. More of these entities are now interdependent, meaning that they have some support from the university and maybe their own resources, sometimes a credit card contract or an insurance program or a small endowment. You have functions like that that earn them money so that they can stay interdependent, but there's more and more of them, increasingly so, are becoming dependent. There are a few out there today. So we look at today. Where are we in 2014? There are very few that are fully independent associate alumni programs out there, meaning that they have no support or connection to the university in any way. There's only a handful we're talking about here. Just as a curious or interesting anecdote here, the term autonomous, I wanted to make sure I could use it in this context, so I Googled it, looked at the dictionary.com definition of autonomous, and an ad within the definition of autonomous popped up for the University of Michigan Alumni Association. Right on the page as I was looking for, how am I using the word in the right context here? I thought I had it, I did, but it was really interesting to me that the University of Michigan Alumni Association popped up, and it's an example we're using later on in our PowerPoint that you'll see Shane talk through. So there are a few, that's one example, but most are interdependent with each other, where there's an engagement program with a reporting structure into advancement, and then this notion of being more increasingly dependent, where they're fully funded by the institution that they work for. And now let's look ahead into the future. I'm going to turn it to Shane and let him talk about this a little bit. Shane, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. So before we dive into a little bit more about structures and specific examples, I think it's, Chris gave a nice background about the history of alumni relations and kind of the trends. But what does the future look like? I don't know how many people on the webinar follow Andy Shanlane and his Alumni Futures blog, but it's a really great read, so I recommend everyone take a look at it. I'm happy to make a quick plug here. Andy currently oversees alumni relations and annual giving at Carnegie Mellon University. Prior to that, Alumni Futures was his consulting business, which he kind of pretty much took internationally. And prior to that, he oversaw the Caltech Alumni Association. So Andy has a long history in the business, and many people would consider him a thought leader, both on what has happened and kind of where we're going. So before Chris and I did this presentation in January, this very prescient blog posting came up on Andy's blog talking about fundraising's relationship to alumni relations. Anyone who works in advancement, primarily at universities, of course, will know things have changed rapidly in the last 10 to 15 years. The tools have changed, the way we think about volunteers has changed, the kind of scope and scale of what we do has changed, missions, budgets, et cetera. So there's been a lot of revolutionary change. But what does the future look like as this happens? Andy, in his quote here, I'm going to move forward in a second, argues that things are going to be virtually unrecognizable to us in the future as compared to where they are now. He definitely sees a lot more of a marriage between alumni relations and development, specifically, and probably not surprising to too many people in the business, that annual giving and alumni relations is really where that marriage can and most efficiently and effectively happen, based on the constituencies we all communicate with, try to fundraise from, engage to advance our universities. And Andy argues here that fundraising is dead, and that things will just become much more interwoven, and the shape of how advancement organizations, the shape that they take in the future will be much different. So I just wanted everyone to have this as kind of a primer before we kind of dive in a little bit more to the specific structures and examples of what we're talking about. And again, feel free to follow Andy's blog moving forward. So I wanted to kind of get to some nitty-gritty around these advancement structures and systems. I do want to reiterate, Chris has mentioned it, I've mentioned it, there is no cookie-cutter approach. There's no black and white here. This is messy. We all know, regardless of size and scope of an institution, there's a lot of complexity around here that either allows or precludes a different organization from going along the spectrum. And here are just a few elements that I wanted to touch on. And this is not nearly exhaustive. We all know that there are specifics here that I can't list. So I wanted to just kind of dive into each of these really quickly before moving on to examples. The first is you need to think about your advancement organizational structure. Again, some structures currently or in the future look differently than others. There's the structure where you've got a head vice president of advancement or alumni affairs and development, and clearly that's aligned in a different way than what we'll see later, where you have a separate vice president of alumni relations, a separate vice president or head of development. So those structural issues are kind of prime when thinking about this. The second question to think about in scope, and we asked, in the poll, are you from a university, from a college, whether that's 2 or 4 year? Are you from a specific school within a broader university, or are you kind of an autonomous school on your own? That actually has implications. We will see that a little bit later based on at least my own experience working at MIT. The third thing is there's a lot of legal implications here. Obviously, these are organizations, and they have a lot of different legal challenges. If you want to move along the spectrum a little bit closer to the right, how do you really fully integrate things and change your scope if that's the goal? We all, a lot of universities have membership and dues paying structures that they need to grapple with. There's also alumni magazines. A lot of affinity programs are out there. And so there's a lot of legal implications there that affect this dialogue as well. The thing we shouldn't ever lose sight of is what is the point of view of leadership or the existing kind of reporting lines at an organization. Chris did mention that later, but if you have a new vice president or head of alumni relations coming in and he or she has a different philosophy than the past, that clearly could lead to a different kind of model that everyone in the organization might have to manage, work with, identify opportunities so that you can kind of continue on. So I think that perspective or point of view or philosophy can really be a critical part of this whole conversation. The next point here is there are functional criteria to think about. How is your organization actually structured? In alumni relations, are there class-based systems? Are there affinity-based programs? Young alumni, social media, career services, whatever. How does that, again, if you're moving along the spectrum in any way, how closely can you fully align just based on your current structure, or how do you have to think about the future in a different way? Reporting lines, obviously quite important to anyone in any organization, but it clearly matters here. Who reports to whom is a big deal, especially at the top in many ways, and that's kind of the way we identify the spectrum in many ways. And the last couple, resource allocation is a huge deal now. We all know, we're all trying to do more with less, regardless of situation or organization. And a lot of times you can make the argument at a big organization that, if you want more resources, you kind of need to be able to combine strategies and plans and other levels of resources. So I think resource allocation is a big part of this dialogue that will continue moving forward. And I think a lot of institutions have grappled with that. Probably, especially in state institutions, I wouldn't be surprised just because they've lost a significant amount of funding from state budget cuts over the last few years. And the final, which would never be missed when talking about higher education, history, culture, and tradition play a huge part in this, of course. And so that is a really foundational element to all of this, and that's actually why it's at the bottom, just to make sure it's really important and kind of buttresses the rest of the criteria we need to think about. Every institution has its own history, culture, and tradition, and there's a lot of little nuances that cannot be forgotten or dismissed when thinking about where you are in the spectrum or where your leadership might be going in the future. So again, there's no cookie-cutter approach. Everyone needs to look at this slide as a series of strategic ideas and potential barriers or opportunities to thinking of your organization's future. And being strategic and goal-oriented is quite imperative here. These are all really strategic elements that obviously have specific bullet points underneath that I kind of alluded to. So I'm going to move forward and move on to some examples. First, I'm going to start on the left side of the spectrum that Chris and I spoke about and talk about kind of some separate organizations. A lot of these kind of are legal in nature. For example, here we've got Texas A&M University, which is a large public land-grant university. Its alumni association is called the Association of Former Students. And this is a primarily separate organization because it is separate. It's set up as a separate 501c nonprofit alumni association with its own staff. One thing that I find that's interesting about them, though, is they might be separate in terms of their legal structure. However, their leadership council, they're kind of they're highly leveraged alumni leaders. They have to be an annual fund donor for them to actually be eligible for this leadership council. So there's clearly a marriage between alumni relations and development with Texas A&M. But when you think about the spectrum, we're thinking about there are legal implications and organizational structures here that keep them separate. And then their president, CEO, or the leader of their organization actually must be a Texas A&M graduate. So they kind of do keep things close to home because this is its own separate board and organization. The second, Chris mentioned the University of Michigan earlier. University of Michigan is one of the largest alumni associations in the world. There's over 540,000 alumni, but they do have a separate, Chris mentioned, autonomous, self-funded 501c3 alumni association that operates independent of the University of Michigan. And its board of directors has full fiduciary responsibility and accountability related to the association's governance. I'm going to skip forward just because, I just want to make sure we're keeping pace with what we need to get here. I want to move to the kind of middle ground here, and this is what we call collaborative on the spectrum. And we have Vanderbilt University here, which is a relatively small, definitely not tiny, private elite university in Tennessee. And they're kind of they're in the middle. They have a vice chancellor. They have an associate vice chancellor of alumni relations who sits on the Alumni Association Executive Committee. I believe he is on this webinar, so thank you for joining us. And their associate vice chancellor reports up to a vice chancellor for development and alumni relations. So this is where you can start seeing that collaborative relationship where there is one big vice president or vice chancellor whom reports to the chancellor, and then that filters its way down through the structure of the organization. Next, we have Santa Clara University out in California, which is a private Jesuit university, and they have a vice president for university relations who oversees development and alumni relations, and then they have an assistant vice president who reports directly to the vice president. So again, this collaborative relationship is more what we're starting to see in terms of how the reporting lines work. One final collaborative model that I want to speak to is, so I used to work at the MIT Sloan School of Management, but MIT Central Alumni Association has a very interesting model where they have an executive vice president for the Alumni Association who actually is the CEO of the Alumni Association, but then there's also a separate vice president for resource development or development. And where this collaborative relationship is really interesting and exciting, I think, for MIT, is that the annual giving staff is a part of the Alumni Association staff. So there's a clear marriage, at least in terms of the staffing structure, between annual giving and alumni engagement professionals. And so I think that is a great example of kind of how this all can work. Moving to the kind of almost far right of the spectrum, I have a few examples. I'm going to skip really quickly to Kutztown University. And as you can see here actually in the logo, Kutztown just went through kind of a reorg. And they are now known as the Foundation and Alumni Engagement operation within the university. And their mission is really focused on raising funds and providing opportunities for alumni. So within the actual overall mission focus of this organization and all the people working on that is a focus on both fundraising as well as engagement and opportunities for alumni. And they're overseen by an executive director who oversees alumni and development staff. But the foundation is structurally separate, but there's an integrated organizational structure. So a lot of little nuances there that I mentioned. The final two examples that I will give before passing it on to Chris are my prior experience in higher ed was at the MIT Sloan School of Management, which is a professional business school at MIT. And prior to my joining, we had an associate dean who came in and integrated the alumni relations and annual giving staff to create more alignment across advancement within the specific school. So when I worked at MIT Sloan, my title as well as my colleagues included alumni relations and annual giving. So even though I had a lot of alumni relations responsibilities, I also had a portfolio or responsibilities to engage alumni on, on making gifts at the annual fund level to the school, as did many of my colleagues. We were under one director whom reported directly to an associate dean. So there was a lot of integration there. It was very clear what our goals were as an organization. The final one I'll pass on, I will mention and then pass on to Chris, is Cornell University, which is my alma mater and where Chris used to work. When we had a new vice president several years ago, he had a real clear philosophy about integration being kind of the way forward. And so he had an associate vice president for alumni relations reporting to him, whose job ultimately at the end of the day was to think about engaging alumni based on not only engagement but also on giving. And Chris, I'm going to pass it on to you now so that you can kind of talk a little bit more about Cornell historically, and then obviously just a specific model that you can speak more to.
Right. Shane, thank you so much. Great job covering those. And let me just add a quick footnote that none of these fall into perfect categories. These are broad generalizations using some of the criteria Shane outlined at the beginning. There's no perfect place to put these, really, but we want to give you a sense of how the spectrum, if you will, is evolving. And if we have time at the end, Shane, perhaps you can just elaborate on the two we had to skip there, Stanford and Northeastern, a little bit more of the detail would be great. If we have some more time at the end. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Cornell and the case study. Let me just hit one question that came in via the chat box. The question I'll repeat it is there a trend or formula used to determine the length that an alumnus is targeted as an activity participant / alumni relations constituent before, quote, graduating to be solely or more specifically targeted as a donor? So this is, if I had to paraphrase it, how long is somebody really the responsibility of alumni relations before they switch over to the responsibility of development? And it's a long answer to whoever asked. I don't have who asked the question. It was forwarded to me by the host of our webinar today. But for whoever asked the question, I think we're going to address it in this case study as I come up. The ultimate answer is there's really no trend or formula, and there are ways in which you can approach that transition, if you will, from an alumni relations person to a development person, an individual alumnus. If we don't answer your question as I review the case study or you want more detail, please feel free. Email me, call me, and I'll be happy to follow up with a lengthier conversation to talk about your specific scenario or your institution, whatever it might be, to elaborate further. So let me talk about Cornell a bit here. Quick timeline to share with you. The school was founded in 1865. We've had alumni relations from the very beginning, some of it organic, like we described earlier. It became more official, in the earlier part of the 20th century. And up until 2006, it was I would describe it, I'd put it more in a separate category. Not a bad thing, it's just how it was, that's how the industry was. It's an Ivy League institution, and there was a very separate engagement function that operated as part of the overall advancement function. In 2006, the new vice president arrived, Charlie Flager, and he had experiences in his history coming up through the profession is that it should operate in more of an integrated model. And over the couple of years before I arrived, from 06 to 08, it was moving into that collaboratively separate category where they were literally in a separate physical location. They had a separate I think alumni director was the title. There were other factors you can point to that would indicate it in this way, but Charlie was moving in to be more collaborative. And when I was hired in 2008, my specific charge when I was brought in was to integrate these two functions and to get these things operating together in a advancement operation that Charlie envisioned for the future. So I arrived in 2008 in the spring. The world changes in the fall of 2008, and like anyone, like it's been said, and my boss used to say, let's not waste a good crisis. So we used the 08-09 time frame to do a major reorganizational change in the overall advancement program. We called it Alumni Affairs and Development, AAD, at Cornell, and moved to a more partially integrated into a fully integrated model. And this ADCD, this reference here I'm going to talk about in a little bit as part of the case study. So over the course of the almost 5 years I was there, we were moving into this more integrated function. Again, that was my charge. We used this reorg and the economic changes that happened to have to leverage our resources in such a way that we can demonstrate a return on an investment that we had just been given, frankly. A lot of our areas were reduced in staff and budget, and in the alumni relations, alumni affairs side, we actually saw some growth in our program with the expectation that we'd operate in a more integrated model. And then I left in 2013. The gentleman who replaced me, Jim Mazza, was a colleague of mine at Cornell, moved into the role not only overseeing alumni relations, but he became the Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations and Annual Giving, overseeing both. So it became more integrated just by the nature of the movement of those two shops together. So there was a, again, a pretty relatively quick history of evolution that took some time to get to, but over the recent year, again, with a change in leader, a vice president who had that vision, that's what happened. So we talked about the history of alumni relations, and again, this is generally speaking, this first bullet here is for the first 100 years of our business. We had all of us, many of us, use this broad-based approach. All alumni are the same. We're going to engage all of them and bring them in closer to the university in the best way we can. Segmentation that took place, or the thinking about how do we break up these populations, how do we define or segment who we're going to mail to, et cetera. For a long time, it was based on two data points that we had in our, not even databases, but today had now databases, but we had class year and we had zip code. So we began doing class-based programming, reunions, et cetera, and then the geographic, obviously clubs or chapters. In more recent history, as you get into more of the advanced, technology comes now to play a part in our profession. The alumni relations industry is now moving into the late 1990s, early 2000s, and you start to see, well, email for sure, but then social media and all kinds of electronic survey instrumentation that's out there now to be able to do some more detailed segmentation. You start to see more professional shops, alumni relations shops, thinking about segmenting their populations based on their behaviors or their preferences or life stages or attitudinal data that comes from a survey. I've seen a lot of really sophisticated programs thinking about it in those ways. Well, what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, I know we have about a little over 10 minutes to go here. I'll use most of it, try to be as quick as I can to talk about this second to last bullet here. Is a segmentation strategy called what I call the development lens. This is looking at your alumni population as all of them as being potential donors, differentiated only by their capacity and their inclination, and in some ways by their current behavior. What are they doing around giving? And we actually employed this as a way of approaching our work. I'll say right now, going into this next few minutes, that this can be viewed by an alumni relations purist as controversial or even heretical, perhaps, because there are some people out there who believe we shouldn't even be thinking about this. I think there is merit in doing this. I also think that a broad-based approach is absolutely necessary, but what I'm encouraging here in the next few minutes for all of you is to keep an open mind and think about this as an approach to consider in addition to the other work you're doing. So let's leave it at that for now, and I'll end this slide by saying I'm near the end of publishing a white paper on this exact topic, and I would love, once it gets done, to share it with this audience, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of it once it gets finalized. We're near the end of it. So this is how that development lens works. So this is the evolution of the thinking that we have. When I was at Cornell over the 09, about 13 when I left time frame, this is how we broke up the population. Now, we had about 225,000 alumni, and if you take off the alumni relations glasses and you put on your development glasses and you say, okay, who falls into these buckets? We called it the ABCD approach. At the top, you had principal, high-level major gifts, basically $1 million and above, and by the way, you'll see later on in this slide deck that not every school fits into these categories exactly. The segments will vary, but for us, this is what it was. What was the B is the major gift prospects and high-level annual giving donors, $100K to $1 million gift level, either current behavior or potential to give at that level. C's was anybody who was an annual fund donor, any dollar amount up to $100K, and then anybody who was a volunteer, whether they gave or not. Most of our volunteers at the time were donors, so they fell in there anyway, but there were some, like every school, have volunteers that aren't financial contributors. They give their time, and that's what they feel their contribution is, but we still counted them as C's. And then I labeled this last category, the Ds, as future donors. These people that are not currently giving in any way. Their giving is zero, but they all have potential. So if you were to take our 125,000 people, it's always interesting to think about your population. If you did this with your population, my guess is your percentages will come in close to what these are here. But 150,000 of our alumni fell into that category. 2/3 of our population did not have a giving history in the year we draw the lines, if you will, and segment the population. Over a 5-year window, this number is smaller because you have people who give some years but not others, obviously, but look at a 1-year window, this is what you'd see, 150,000 people in the D category, a huge chunk in the C category, 27%. These are our tried and true donors, our volunteers, and then the last two I'll put together because we really thought of A's and B's together. We didn't really necessarily distinguish our work with just A's or B's. We'll get to that in a second. But the last two are pretty small populations, 5 and 1%. So this is the development lens, looking at your population where you're not worried about alumni relations at all. Again, controversial, I know, but it's something to consider as an option here. A question just came in. How do you code or classify people who purchase services, products from the school, et cetera, if there's a charge? I had that same question come to me from another colleague when we were drafting this white paper about a large public school that has a dues-based program and also sells insurance and credit cards and license plates and other things that where they would indicate some behavior of having that may fall into this sort of development lens category. The answer to the question is it's going to be different for every school. At Cornell, we didn't have that, so we were doing it more purely like this. For a large public model that has some of those things, you might have a different way of defining what your C category might be, as an example. So I think that answers your question, whoever asked it, but if you want to elaborate or follow up more, please do so. Again, I'm just wary of time here. So again, I mentioned before your parameters will vary. We just talked about a variance right there. Some schools may have a different group of people who fall into that C bucket, for example, who are people who are purchasing other services or benefits from the university. The second point is key. This is not meant to replace a broad-based engagement strategy. This is an addition to. I'll talk more about that in a little bit of how you can do both. In fact, at Cornell, we still had homecomings, we still had reunions, we still had clubs and chapters and all those things, but we had a portion of our programming that was more purposely wearing the development lens when they thought about their planning for the year, for example. So I'll emphasize this over and over again, that this broad-based strategy is absolutely necessary, but this other approach allows you to, these last few bullets, establish this common language with your development colleagues. It's actually opened the door for us to have relationships with our colleagues in development that we weren't able to have before. And that changed the way we were thought of, you know, the old notion of alumni relations being the party planners, those who got to do tailgate parties. This legitimized our work in such a way that we were at the table with them and able to have conversations that can be very strategic in what we can do, and I'll get to that in a second. And then there's this notion that all of you may have heard some version of this, where the work we do in alumni relations is really not about this campaign, it's about the next campaign and the one after that. I've always heard that. I believe that to be true. Building that pipeline of engaged alumni who may become donors, those that have capacity to make transformational gifts break down the road, that's what alumni relations does. I think this approach, if you combine a targeted and what I call this development lens, targeted approach with a broad-based strategy, you can have that same long-term look at the view of the world, but it also can impact the current campaign by having specific work done with the higher level, again, development lens, higher level prospects, if you're working with that A and B population. And that's where I throw out the term ROI, return on investment, for a VP to see that an engagement program is actually engaging, cultivating, and stewarding their highest level prospects in such a way that's leading to gifts in this campaign. That's a win for an alumni relations program who's looking for more resources. So I encourage you to think about it in those terms. Here's some of the goals of this model. I just talked about the first one. We work with our development officers to cultivate, steward those A's and B's, work with our annual fund colleagues to do the same with the C's. We were always thinking about how do we get B's to be C's. That was something that was important to what we do. We didn't ask for gifts at events, so people often say to me, what does that mean? Do you have people who had portfolios? No. Do you ask for gifts at events? No. But we did it eliminate the possibility of using event attendance, as for example, to solicit gifts. I mean, that's something you can do after the fact. So there's, again, it became a mindset, it became a language, it became a lens that we put on to help us view the world a little bit differently. And this fourth one, we call the happy a circumstance that might occur every now and then, where in that depopulation, we found that alum who should have been categorized a lot higher, and we moved them up the chain very quickly. So identification becomes a part of the goal of this model as well. This is the resource structure I was referencing earlier. How do you do this within the context of your operation? Well, I suggest that a majority of the work you do is broad-based, but a portion of it be focused on A, B, C, and D, or you assign certain resources to think about how do you move people between segments, or how do you work with people in a specific segment. And then to the question that was asked earlier about whether they're purchasing service and products from a school, this dues-based model, here's an answer. Perhaps if there's a few schools that have only dues-based dollars, and they should be thinking about broad-based approach, and perhaps this model doesn't work for them. I understand that. But most of our large public schools out there that have a dues-based program also get institutional support. And a way to do this would be, how about we take some of that institutional support and focus it on that A and B and maybe some of the C population, and then the dues money that comes in, we're going to focus on the broad-based engagement. That's a way to approach your resource allocation and your staffing arrangement to address these needs of these different populations. I mentioned this already. These two things can coexist. They're not mutually exclusive. I'll argue that what I'm describing here in this ABC development lens approach is not. Someone might say to you, this is just development work. You're not even talking about alumni. This is all about development. I think this is strategic and targeted alumni relations. You may just say that's just semantics. But for me, I think this is the way I'm seeing the industry moving. This is the way the trends are. I wouldn't put this in. I would personally say this is the best practice. There's some people who agree with me and say this is absolutely the wrong thing to do with alumni relations. I understand that. I'm open to a debate on this issue, so that's part of the reason we're promoting this webinar and a white paper coming out soon. I already mentioned this common language and a common approach between the two alumni relations development sides, and I actually believe there really shouldn't be sides. We're all on the same team working to support the institutions. And the final thoughts, we've talked about this throughout. There's really no right answer. There's no one-size-fits-all. It's just about a mindset and a common language. This is something to consider if you're thinking about asking for more resources. Here's a way to get it, I think, to argue with this as a criteria for what you might do with those resources. There's also this notion that the landscape of higher education is changing. We're talking about accountability and metrics all the time. If our industry of alumni relations doesn't come to the table with a clear way to demonstrate return on investment, define the work we do in more tangible terms, to have metrics for engagement, these are all things that I think are important, and this model, I believe, allows you to do that a little bit easier. And I think, generally speaking, it's the evolution of our profession. We're seeing more and more of this happening. I'll stop here. We're closing in with a few minutes to go, and I'm going to hit a couple of questions here. I'll let Shane add, but I'll close by saying this. So one might, who attended this webinar, say, well, so what? What's the purpose of it? What's the big deal about all this? And my answer, I have four of them, would be, I think it's absolutely important for us in the industry to be aware of what's happening and the trends that are going on. You may end up with a boss or transitioning to a new place where one of these scenarios is in place or you're going to be moving that way, and it's important to know about it. The third one would be is to be aware of models that are out there and others that might have common ground with you that you can learn from. And I think it's important for all of us to encourage each other to be open-minded about different approaches and the ways that we can think about our business that we haven't perhaps yet before. To me, that's important. Shane, anything you want to add to this? And we'll hit a couple of questions that have come in before we wrap.
Nope, I don't have anything to add, Chris. Thank you. You did a great job.
So the other question that came in, R. Lolan, pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure, but do you have data, results, evidence that one model produces better results than the other? Greater goodwill, greater support, etc. It's a great question. That's getting into the engagement metrics category, and again, a longer answer than the less than minute we have on the call, but whoever asked that question, please feel free to send me an email or set up a phone call. We'll follow up with people who have answers, or questions, I should say, who want answers to whatever is on your mind. I'm happy to do that as part of the role that we have as this webinar is the follow-up, so please feel free to fire away. Anthony, I know you're taking over here. Anything else you want to add, or shall we do the close?
Nope, we've opened up the end of webinar poll, so if people could take that before they leave, we'd really appreciate it.
We'll stay on. The poll is open for 5 minutes. We're going to stay on for these 5 minutes to look at, if I can figure out how to do this. I just got it. We'll look at our chat box and to see if anybody weighs in. I have not been monitoring if anyone has raised their hand for a audio question. I'm hoping somebody back at home base will do it. I don't see any hands up right now. Please feel free, as you're answering that question, or actually responding to the survey for this webinar, to type in a chat question or a comment or a response or whatever you'd like. The silence is deafening. I'll add to Shane's comment. Thanks for joining, everyone. We ended up with a little over 50 people, which is great. Thrilled with that. I'd love to hear from people. You see on the last slide here our contact information, phone, email, and Twitter handle. Please feel free to send us a note and follow up. We just had a question come in from Kim Went. Hi, Kim. I'm curious about how you integrated annual fund with the Alumni Association. To be honest with you, that happened after I left. I'm assuming you're talking about Cornell when you asked that question. There are many schools who have moved to this model of the two integrated. Again, in the few minutes we have, it's hard to answer that. It's a big question right there, Kim, to be honest with you. Yeah, so you did say yes, you're talking about Cornell. So Charlie Flager, the vice president, had 5 associate vice presidents reporting to him. When I left, he moved one of the other AVPs out of the role. He was overseeing the college program. We have different programs within the colleges and units within the university. They moved Jim out of that position and put Jim in my old role and added annual giving to the annual fund to his portfolio, and said go, basically. So Jim then had the task of figuring out how these two things work. Now, one, we were already working pretty closely with them. We had moved physically to the same building as them, and we're all on the same floor of that building, so we walk by each other all the time. We tried to, whenever we could, interact with each other socially, offline, but also professionally. And so things were already sort of in place in December 12 when I left, and in January 13, the structure merged by virtue of the vice president saying we're going to do it this way now, and they spent the last year plus figuring out how these two models come together. And there's a little bit of a reorg, and they had to work on how those things happen. It's probably a better question to ask Jim directly what they did, but I've seen lots of models that have moved this way. I've come upon models that have been this way for years. So there's lots to it. I see you followed up here. I have considered integrating gold annual fund activities. Yeah, so graduates of the last decade with our Alumni Association. I wondered if that was the start or if they went all in. That's a great way to do it, I think, actually, Kim, is to think about it with the young alumni that are going to usually, generally speaking, be your lower donors, harder to get because there's lots of numbers and they have all kinds of reasons why they don't want to give back, etc. Student loans, all that. If a way to ease your way into this is to start with the last 10 years out merged with the alumni relations function, I think that's brilliant. It actually will probably demonstrate success to the point where you're going to see over time the whole thing merging together, but I don't think you need to go all in, to your question. I think it's okay to start dip your toe in and move in. Shane, I'm sure you have an opinion on this one.
Yep. No, I would definitely agree, Chris, and as kind of a still gold alumnus myself, and having volunteered on that side but also managed programs, I think that is the right approach and way to kind of start fully integrating. It tends to start, especially in this day and age, at that level. And as an alumnus who has seen it and tried it, it just kind of seemed natural in some ways.
Yeah, we started, one of the other ways to do it would be to move a student or a senior class gift into the Alumni Association, start there, and then transition those seniors into the first year out and continue to work with those donors in an engagement capacity, but also in a giving capacity to keep that retention rate up. Instead of, most of these schools have these huge participation rates for senior class gift, and they drop it to the teens and the first year out. There's a way to transition it and to show value right away with a team of your people who are thinking about young alumni and student engagement. I see, Kim, you added, thanks for calling me potentially brilliant. Kudos to you for being brilliant, not even potentially. Shane actually was the victim as an alumnus, as a young alum, of our thinking in a similar capacity. We shifted this student and young alumni program, new resources that we added in '09, not long after Shane graduated, to engage this young population with both things in mind, both as alumni we want to be engaged and close with the institution, volunteers, et cetera, but also donors. And Margot Niederbach, who was the one we hired to do that, was on this chat. At least she was signed up to be. I saw her log in. I'm not sure if she's still on or not, but if you want a connection with somebody who worked with that young population to do it at Cornell, I'm happy to broker introduction, Kim, with you and Margot Niederbach.
Shout out to Margot.
Still got about 20 people on the call. Any other questions come in on chat, please fire away. You're welcome, Kim. Kim, you're our all-star participant. You had the most.
You are.
Anthony, how are we doing on survey responses? Most people responded by now?
Yeah, Chris, the poll has actually closed because we only get 5 minutes to administer it.
Okay. All right, so we're back to 5. So I motion to adjourn, and I thank the remaining 20 people who are hanging into the bitter end. And to those that participated in any format, please accept my thanks and follow up afterwards via email or pick up the phone and call or send a tweet. Shane would do the same. Shane, thank you for your help doing this as well.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure, and thanks to everyone on the call. And I also look forward to kind of keeping in touch with everyone.
And Anthony and Lena, thank you back in Chicago for your help putting this together. I appreciate it. Hope it went well from your perspective.
Yep, thanks, guys. We're going to close the webinar now.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.